Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a really fascinating, completely neutral look into a highly specific biological framework. We're going to unpack the mechanics of postpartum psychosis, specifically according to the theories of German New Medicine, or GNM for short. Now, whether you're a total expert on this framework or literally hearing about it for the very first time, our goal today is to neutrally explore the structural logic of this theory. We want to understand exactly how it connects the mind, the brain, and the body during one of the absolute most intense periods of a woman's life.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the GNM biological framework, then move on to the Temporal Lobes Constellation. After that, we'll look at the pregnancy hormone shift, followed by vagitonic protection during gestation, and we'll wrap up with sudden postpartum reactivation.
All right, Section 1, the GNM biological framework. Let's set the stage. To really understand postpartum psychosis in this context, we first have to establish the foundational rule of German New Medicine, and that is the inseparable, hardwired link between our psyche, our brain, and our organs. In GNM, literally everything starts with what's called a DHS, or a Geerd Hamer syndrome. In this framework, a DHS is defined as an unexpected, acute conflict shock. But here's the absolutely crucial point. It is not just a psychological event. Actually, scratch that. It is a profoundly biological one. Imagine you're caught completely off guard by a traumatic event. Well, that shock simultaneously registers in your psyche, leaves a physical mark on a very specific, predetermined area of your brain, and immediately alters the function of the exact organ controlled by that brain relay. This biological shock is the engine for all physical and mental conditions in the GNM paradigm.
And this quote brilliantly illustrates a massive paradigm shift. You know, in traditional psychiatry, the mind and body are often treated as kind of separate entities. But as Dr. Hamer states here, mental health is physically anchored in the brain's relays and their connected organs. According to this theory, you simply cannot have a psychosis without a corresponding biological change happening in the brain and body.
Moving on to Section 2, the Temporal Lobes Constellation.
So with that foundation in place, let's narrow our focus to the specific area of the brain that's responsible for mood, behavior, and eventually psychosis within this framework, the temporal lobes. In GNM, severe mental and behavioral changes are explained by this concept called a schizophrenic constellation. This happens when someone experiences not just one, but two active biological conflicts, and those shocks simultaneously impact opposite hemispheres of the brain. Think of it kind of like an electrical short circuit across the brain's hemispheres.
Take a look at the visual symmetry here. When one biological conflict impacts the left temporal lobe and a second active conflict impacts the right temporal lobe, boom, a temporal lobes constellation is formed. According to the source material, this specific dual-hemisphere engagement is exactly what creates manic-depressive or bipolar states in a person.
Now, how those moods actually express themselves is governed by what GNM calls the scale rule. Imagine a physical seesaw sitting right inside the brain. If the biological conflict on the left temporal lobe is more intense, well, the scale tips left, and the person's mood becomes distinctly manic. If the conflict on the right temporal lobe is heavier, the scale tips right, resulting in a depressed mood. And if they're perfectly balanced, you see a manic-depressive state. What's really interesting is that GNM asserts that once this constellation is formed, it literally halts major tissue changes on the corresponding organs. It's like it freezes the physical disease to prioritize the psychological coping mechanism.
Section 3, the pregnancy hormone shift.
So we've got our mechanism for mania and depression. But how does biology modify this rule when a woman becomes pregnant? Well, hormones act as a huge biological modifier for how we perceive trauma. Under a normal estrogen status, a woman perceives biological conflicts in a typical quote-unquote female fashion. But during pregnancy and lactation, a woman's estrogen levels naturally drop. In GNM, this low estrogen status dramatically changes her perception. It basically causes her to experience sudden conflicts in a male fashion. So instead of female nesting conflicts, she suddenly perceives shocks as territorial conflicts.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how that hormonal shift dictates brain mapping. Because her estrogen is low, a sudden shock during pregnancy, say an intense fear of a miscarriage, which is a territorial fear conflict, completely bypasses the left female lobe. It's forced to land squarely on the right temporal lobe, which is the male conflict area. And, as we just learned from the scale rule, conflicts on the right side of the brain induce depression.
Okay, Section 4, vagitonic protection during gestation.
We know these conflicts are landing during pregnancy, but nature actually has a built-in mechanism to ensure the mother and child survive these shocks.
Let's walk through the biological timeline of gestation, because this perfectly structures the physical and emotional journey of pregnancy according to GNM. During the first trimester, the mom is in sympathikotonia. Think of it as a very active fight-or-flight stress state. This perfectly explains why morning sickness and nervousness happen early on. But right at the 4th month, a massive biological shift occurs. Her autonomic nervous system forces her into vagotonia. This is a deep, prolonged rest and digest state of protection, and it lasts all the way until childbirth.
This vagotonic state acts like a biological shield. The physical adaptations are honestly amazing. The uterus muscles relax to prevent premature birth. The stapedius muscle in her middle ear relaxes, which drastically heightens her sensitivity to noise so she wakes at the slightest sign of danger. The deep fatigue forces her to rest and not overexert herself. But most importantly for our topic today, if she suffers a conflict shock during this time, the vagotonia actively suppresses the intensity of both the psychological distress and the physical organ changes. The conflicts are essentially put on pause to protect the growing fetus.
Finally, Section 5, Sudden Postpartum Reactivation.
So what happens when that biological shield suddenly drops? This brings us to the dramatic switch of childbirth and the true origin of postpartum psychosis in this model. In GNM, the act of childbirth is referred to as the epileptoid crisis. It is the exact pivotal moment when that protective resting state of vagotonia abruptly ends. All of those biological conflicts that the mother experienced during pregnancy, the ones that were safely muffled and suspended by her hormones, they are instantly reactivated at full intensity. The shield drops, and the psychological backlog hits her all at once.
If the mother suffered just one unresolved territorial conflict during her pregnancy, maybe it was a territorial anger conflict at work, or deep fear over the baby's health, it reactivates heavily on the right temporal lobe because of her low estrogen. And because of that heavy weight landing on the right side, the scale tips into a severe depressive state. This is exactly how GNM explains postpartum depression. It's not just some random hormone imbalance, it's a very specific reactivated conflict. Let's move on and see how this builds into full-blown psychosis. If a woman had an active conflict on her left temporal lobe prior to pregnancy, and then she suffered a new territorial conflict on her right temporal lobe during pregnancy, childbirth reactivates both sides simultaneously. The protective shield ends, the dual conflicts flare up, the brain short-circuits across the hemispheres, and she is instantly thrust into a full temporal lobes constellation. This intense manic-depressive constellation is what we call postpartum psychosis.
Seeing these side by side really cements the theory, doesn't it? On the left, we've got a single hemisphere impact resulting in unipolar postpartum depression. On the right, we see the dual hemisphere constellation, representing bipolar postpartum psychosis. The severity and the exact nature of the mental shift post-delivery are entirely dependent on whether one or both sides of the brain are harboring unresolved biological shocks.
And the specific flavor of that psychosis? It isn't random at all. It directly depends on the exact combination of biological conflicts the mother experienced. For example, an autistic constellation is going to manifest as severe social withdrawal. A flying constellation might propel the new mother into a state of extreme manic euphoria. And an aggressive constellation results in highly confrontational behavior, and in severe cases, the devastating risk of harm to herself or her newborn baby. The psychosis is viewed as a direct reflection of the specific biological traumas she endured. Which brings us to our final slide today. We've explored how German New Medicine constructs a highly specific, mechanistic view of postpartum psychosis, linking emotional shocks directly to brain hemispheres, hormonal modifiers, and the protective timelines of gestation. Whether you view this as a radical paradigm shift or simply a fascinating theoretical framework, it leaves us with a really provocative question. If our psychological distress is so deeply and physically interlocked with brain relays and biological timelines, how might this alter the way we look at holistic health and the way we support mothers postpartum? Definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.